If you're worried about should you include any meat in your diet, how much meat should you include in your diet? Should you avoid meat at all costs? Then this video is going to help you understand these questions from an ancestral perspective. We have lots of evidence of what human beings have eaten over the last 300 years and evidence of what our ancestors have eaten for 1,000,000 years. And so if you have a common sense bone in your body, you're going to realize that, gosh, if our ancestors have been doing something for millions of years, then it's probably okay, perhaps even healthy, perhaps even optimal to continue to eat the diet that our ancestors have eaten. I've got the great honor today of having Miki Ben-Dor here. He is an archaeologist, anthropologist, paleoanthropologist who's been studying this topic for years, and he is going to give us insight into the literature, not just nutrition and medical literature, but the anthropology, the paleoanthropology of this question, which the more I try to rediscover a proper human diet, I find that question to be very, very important. So without further ado, welcome, Doctor. It's such a pleasure, such an honor.
Same here, same pleasure,
yeah. Give us a quick biographical on you, your training, what you specialize in, etc.
Okay, I started my training as an economist and did also business administration and worked for until I was about 52 in a commercial setting. In the end, I was buying companies, unfortunately not for myself.
Right.
But and then at 52, I decided to retire and went on to study archaeology, and especially interested in hunter-gatherers. Because this is at least in Tel Aviv University, this is the place where I could learn more about hunter-gatherers as they serve as a model. Recent hunter-gatherers serve as a model for archaeology, for many archaeologists. So they tend to study them quite intensely.
Yes.
So then I did a PhD in archaeology, but in fact it's a paleoanthropology in American terms.
Yes, and that's one of the things that I've been studying for the last few years is the diet of existing hunter-gatherers. And also, I'm a great student of American history as well. And so in my research and reading about Native Americans and their current plight, it occurred to me that, all the hunter-gatherer societies that we still have in the United States, the Comanche, the Navajo, the Apache, the Kickapoo, none of these indigenous people are on the land that they would choose to be on if they hadn't been driven off their land, kind of their ancestral hunting ground. And then when I started looking at other hunter-gatherer cultures in Africa and Australia, I found that they too have been pushed to what we would call marginal land, basically the land that nobody else wants, that is the most unproductive land possible. And so that made me question how much weight we can put on what the diet is of modern hunter-gatherer cultures. Could you go into that a little bit? What can we learn from modern hunter-gatherers? How much have they been touched by modern society, and how much has their diet been changed by being pushed to basically worthless marginal land?
There are two processes, one that you described, and the other one is that even if they had chosen the land, or they could live in the chosen land, it is not the same land that existed over 2.5 million years of their evolution. So You're right, absolutely. The land is not the same land. For instance, you're talking about Americans, and there it's very, very obvious. But a lot of archaeologists use the Hadza of Tanzania as a model. These Hadza live, and I was there about 2 years ago. They live in a bush which has doesn't. It's not a savanna, okay? Uh, if you go about 2 hours north or so, you come across the Serengeti and you come across Ngorongoro, which is game reserves, and there you see what kind of animals savanna can carry, and what is the relative biomass that savannas have, or fauna compared to flora. And you see that where the Hadza lives today, uh, there is no savanna, there is no grass to speak of. So the animals that live there today are small and few and far between. So it's not the same conditions. You know, already in the 60s, archaeologists used a lot of analogies with recent cultures, and they came to the conclusion that in order to have an analogy, you have to have the environmental aspects and also the technological aspects. Both of them identical or close to being identical in order to do an analogy. That's not the case today at all. Not from the technological and not from the environmental. So, and I wrote a paper about it, and what I said is that there's only one context that you can actually use observations, uh, some sort of analogy, and this is where you find the same thing in many environmental circumstances, in different environmental circumstances. So if you find the same thing in the North Pole and in the equator, then you can say, okay, that makes sense, and it's very likely. And for instance, example, one of them is the fact that hunter-gatherers share their hunts. And this is true in the North Pole, and this is true in the equator. So you can assume that this sharing took place also during our evolution. But definitely, especially the ratio of quantitative aspects, like the ratio of plants to animal source food, there's no way you can learn anything from present hunter-gatherers.
And the reason I asked that question is we see many influencers, some of them doctors, either MDs or PhDs, kind of touting the modern hunter-gatherer diet as the diet that we should eat. And that's why I asked that question, because I believe that sets up a false paradigm, because these people, first of all, are not on any hunting ground that they would choose if they had their choice. And then secondly, as you intimated, there's been several extinction level events over the last few million years, but one that really affected the Homo sapiens sapien culture was some people call it the Younger Dryas event about 12,700 years ago. We don't know if it was volcanoes or a huge asteroid or some combination, but there was a huge extinction event of the megafauna, which would be animals weighing over 100 pounds. And so prior to that event, all of our ancestors let me just clarify, I am an armchair anthropologist, paleoanthropologist. I have no formal training whatsoever, but the way I read the literature before, so let's just say 13,000 years ago for even numbers, there was a much larger selection of megafauna to be hunted on the savannas. And it seems that that's what our ancestors tended to focus on. But then after whatever that event was, 12,700 or so years ago, we had to focus more on smaller game. We had to focus more on including more plants in our diets? Any enlightenment you can give us on that time period?
Okay, but I have to be careful here as a
Yes.
presumably scientist. For comparison with the Paleolithic, what I said is relevant. But for comparison and the question of whether it is healthy or not, then we have to be a little bit more careful, because these hunter-gatherers, and even if you go even further, closer to us, if you take, Western price societies, they were healthy. So it doesn't mean that we cannot draw some conclusions about healthy foods from hunter-gatherers, recent hunter-gatherers. But this goes to the crux of I think, my little angle as far as what paleo is. And what paleo is, in my opinion, is a safety template. In other words, it's not that we cannot eat plants. People who ate plants, including hunter-gatherers, including more recent societies, they were, most of them were quite healthy. We are in terrible shape, not because we eat plants, but because, in my opinion, because we eat the wrong plants, we don't prepare the plants, and we don't know what is our genetical makeup that is we are adjusted to eat or adapted to eat plants. For instance, in myself, I have a very, very strong gluten sensitivity. I don't have celiac, but I have very strong gluten sensitivity. But I didn't know that. And I ate bread. And you say, okay, we eat bread. Bread today is nothing compared to the bread that traditional societies eat. We have in Israel, we have the Jews from all over the place, all over the world. So we have from Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, they have different form. The bread come from teff, not from wheat.
Right.
Different form of cereal, I was going to say. And they ferment the teff for 2 weeks before they consume it. And nobody delayed consumption of food for 2 weeks without reason.
Excellent.
So we call bread, and we call bread what is now done in 1 hour, what the French use when the French do their bread, they ferment it for 12 hours, etc., etc. When the Indians eat chapati, this is a low gluten species, okay, of wheat. So the Japanese are adapted specifically to their diet. Every community that live for a long time with a certain diet, first of all, know very well how to prepare the diet, and secondly, are adapted genetically to the diet. So all these blue zones actually represent societies or communities that lived for a long time in the same place, know how to prepare their food. I'm not speaking of other problems with the reporting on what they eat, because in Sardinia, for instance, the one that actually live longer life eat almost only food from animal sources.
Yep.
But then they report that they eat. The reporting, the data is funny, but and this is the problem today. So hunter-gatherers can be a good model for healthy eating if we know everything But since we don't, let's go back to our evolutionary. That's my point of view. Let's go back to the safety of our evolutionary safest food, which is meat.
Oh, I totally agree. Now, there are many people who would say, well, Dr. Barry, Dr. Ben-Dor, how do you even know? How can you possibly know what a human being ate 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, a million years ago? That has to be unknowable. So walk us through the technology and the research. So if you find a fossil of an ancient human who's 85,000 years old, how can you possibly determine if that person ate red meat, if how much meat they ate, how do you know if they ate C3 versus C4 grains? How can you tell how much meat they ate? Walk us through that, keeping in mind that many of us are not paleoanthropologists, and so try to explain this in common sense terms. How do you even know that?
You know, the funny thing is that the answer is not in archaeology. Uh, Intuitively, people came to archaeologists to ask what they ate, uh, and unfortunately, apart from one area which I will talk about in a minute, uh, you cannot tell. You can tell one thing: we find bones, and we find some less, of course, remains of plant food in archaeological sites going back 2.5 million years ago. So we know what they ate. And what they ate is not a big problem. And there's no argument whatsoever among archaeologists regarding what people ate. They ate whatever they can put their hands on. And this is fish, meat, fruits, tubers, whatever you can think of, they ate. The big question is how much of each, or at least in our terms, how much plants and how much meat and fat. And fat, by the way, also is important because of the problem that, or the image problem that fat has. So the funniest thing is that the question of quantity, as far as archaeology, only one real measure exists, and this is the stable isotopes. But this you can go back only about 50,000 years ago, which is quite a lot. But evolution took place. Human evolution took place over 2.5 million years. So 50,000 years ago, you can take collagen, can extract some collagen from the bone, and you can still measure stable isotopes. And depending on the amount of certain isotope of nitrogen, isotope 15, you can determine what was the relative quantity of meat you do it by measuring the same isotope in carnivores of the same area and herbivores, and you see that the humans were actually had the same level as carnivores. So, and even a little higher than carnivores, but for reasons that we know, but I don't want to go into now. In any case, as far as the isotope 15, the evidence is so clear, whenever you find, and you need to find, not every humans that you can find that's 50 years old will have enough collagen to check, but the ones that you do, they all consume, they were carnivores. There's another way you can know whether it was fish or aquatic, because aquatic organisms have higher nitrogen 15. So if you see that it's way higher than carnivores, then you can determine that they use fish. And you see, when you have a site, for instance, in Sicily, where you have humans that lived, let's say, 15,000 years ago, and then you have another group that lived 5,000 years ago, and another group that lived 3,000 years ago, you see that they used to consume terrestrial meat, and then they moved to fish, and only then they moved to plants when agriculture came. So when the, like you said, when the megafauna started to disappear, they actually switched to fish before they would go to the plants. So this also ties up with another thing that you can learn from hunter-gatherers, again, not independent of where they are, and this is that the return, energetic return on hunting is about 10 times even more than that on gathering, plant gathering. So every theory will tell you, and every economist will tell you, that if the return is 10 times more, people will do it and will forget about the other stuff. It's like going in a supermarket and something costs you 10 times more than the other. Of course, you will buy the cheaper product.
And we actually
So
see
what?
that in modern society now, because it's 10 times cheaper to buy the highly processed grains. That's way
Right.
cheaper, and so many people just make the cheaper choice. But in
Right.
ancient anthropology, it was actually the opposite. It was cheaper to hunt than it was to gather. And then also I think it's self-evident that the nutrition profile of meat versus plants that they had access back then, and the uninflammatoriness of the meat versus the plants, it was cheaper and it was better for you and it was less inflammatory. So of course they were going to make that decision. Now, Jessica Thompson, I'm sure you've heard that name. She has some great
Yes,
research
sure.
that kind of the scavenger hypothesis, because obviously humans need a good source of fat in their diet, and we always have, and we still do. But her hypothesis is that the very first tool that humans used was a big rock, not a worked rock, but just a big fat rock, the biggest rock we could pick up, because we actually would wait for carnivores to clean the bones of meat of some herbivore, get full, then we would either chase them off or just wait for them to leave, and then take that big rock and smash the big bones, smash the skull. And we found that we could eat the brains and eat the bone marrow even days after a kill, because it's basically in its own little airtight container. And so that what do you think about Dr. Thompson's hypothesis that maybe that was the original way that we started moving away from our previous diet and moving towards a more
I
animal-based?
definitely agree with her, and I think most archaeologists do. So, and this is Homo habilis. This is how, yeah. It actually also meets the findings in the field, where you can see the smashed bones, and you can actually archaeologists have a way of separating what they say green bones. When you smash a green bone, which is a fresh bone,
Yes.
to when the bone breaks later on, during to other processes, let's say
Yes.
100,000 years later, when the bone is dry. So yeah, there are definitely signs of smashing all over. I mean, they continue to eat marrow until the last day of the hunter-gatherers.
And we
Marrow was
actually,
always
in medical pathology, we were able to use that same kind of technique. We can tell if a bone was broken during life, or shortly after that victim lost their life, or years later. We can tell by the way the bones break whether the
right.
bones are green or not. And so we still
Right.
use that same thing in medical pathology today. You said that it's pretty evident in archaeology. Now, are there detractors in the fields of paleoanthropology, anthropology, archaeology who would say, no, humans are, and I'm not saying mainstream influencers, I'm saying hardcore paleoanthropological research. Are there any researchers who say, no, humans have eaten a plant-based diet this entire time? They ate meat when they were starving, couldn't get plants, but if they had their choice, they ate plants. Is there anyone in the paleoanthropological community who says such a thing?
Look, there are some, I would say, and by the way, for some reason, there are women that say that plants were a very important part, and they don't really name a relative quantity because, like I said, archaeology just doesn't allow you to do that. And if you want to ignore the stable isotope data, okay, go ahead and do that. But they are very, for instance, they find um, plant remains in the teeth plaque, yeah, and they say, oh, look how important it was. But there's no quantitative evidence in that. The guy could eat for 1 year, he could eat a little more plants than normal. And by the way, the plaque, I think, accumulates more when you eat more. So, but they never measure all the teeth they don't have plaque. you know,
Right.
So how can they say that there's no quantity? So, but let's say that the main problem with the other archaeologists' opinion about this is the hunter-gatherers of today, of recent, because they say, look, they were flexible. They, because as you see today, hunter-gatherers consume from 20% meat to 100% meat, and they all live happily ever after. So, and they say, okay, so this is what was the situation when we were hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic. But this ignores, like you said, this ignores. And by the way, I'm publishing a paper, and I started publishing papers about this decline that you say happened in the recently started 1 million years ago, in my opinion. And humans were responsible for that. And the late quaternary megafauna extinction that you refer to started about 50,000 years ago. But I'm just finishing a paper. We published 2 years ago a paper about the Levant, showing that the decline started much earlier. And now we are publishing another one on Africa, on Southern Africa. And we already have the results of another study from Italy and other indications that decline started very early. So Homo erectus, which is really the species that existed the longest in our evolution, about 1.5 million years, faced larger animals, and many more of them than Homo sapiens, which began his career about 300,000 years ago. So, so evolutionarily speaking, we were facing even more different conditions than we do today. And the energetic return didn't change. The technology was completely different. The Homo erectus, as a hunting weapon, only had wooden-tipped spears. Now, you cannot hunt small animals with wooden-tipped spear. You need to have bow and arrow because they run faster, they're smaller targets, they don't wait for you to come. like an elephant. If you go to an elephant, he is not going to run away. He's not going to escape. So you have other ways you should catch it. But a small animal needs a bow and arrow, and a good one, sometimes with poison on the tip. So, and bow and arrows were available the first time you see bow and arrows about 60,000 years ago. So in the last 2% of human evolution, we had bow and arrow to hunt smaller animals that present hunter-gatherers have today. That's the technology they have today. So if you put the Hadza and take away the bow and arrow and take away the stone tips of they can put on and they, by the way, use metal tips. They don't even use stone tips. Sorry, if you take that away and you leave them with the wooden tip spears, they would not be there because they would not have enough time to gather all the plants that they need in order to survive. They can save a lot of time by having bow and arrow and have iron tips that they don't have to reproduce, for every hunt. So the conclusion about the flexibility doesn't hold. But it's still most of the archaeologists today are not aware of it. They don't, unless they read my papers, they're not aware of it, and they don't accept it. So if you talk to, you talk to people who don't know, you just don't know. They take the information from the wrong source, which is recent hunter-gatherer.
Yes. Now, is there any paleoanthropological, archaeological evidence for a vegan society before 8 to 12,000 years ago? Have we ever found a settlement where the stable isotope analysis
No way.
existed? So in the totality of paleoanthropological literature, how many vegan societies or predominantly plant-based societies have been found and documented?
None. Just none. I think the minimum that I remember is like 30%, which is the Hadza, about 35% meat. So it's not even close. And they know it. And whenever they can, and this is, by the way, Lorraine Cordain also came to that conclusion. Whenever hunter-gatherers can get meat, they prefer meat. And there's so much evidence for that. And so much evidence, by the way, for the preference of fat over meat. Vegetarians, I don't even know if, I don't think that Weston Price found vegetarian
no
community.
And I think he actually go looking initially with that preconceived notion that he was going to find a bunch of plant-based societies, and what he found invariably is they all focused on meat and fat.
The only society that I know today that is really vegetarian is the Indians of India, not the Indian American Indians.
Yes.
Indian of India. They are the sickest society in the world as far as the diabetics and heart problems.
Yeah, they're very metabolically ill, and although they tend to be slimmer on average than adults in the United States, and so for many of us, we equate thinness with health. But I think that we're now finding out that if you actually check some metabolic labs on the Indian population, they're very metabolically ill. And I recently did an interview with someone who is a healthcare provider in India, and we were talking about how Indian culture and society was wrecked basically by the British occupation and colonization. And if you go back in time before the British got there, even let's just say 5,000 years ago, the vast majority of people who lived on the Indian subcontinent were eating meat every time they had opportunity. And I think the stable isotope analysis bears that out as well. Let's talk about the Egyptians for a second, because the Egyptians, through stable isotope analysis and other methods, we know what the Egyptians were eating, not just the pharaoh class of Egyptians, but all classes of Egyptians, because many people think, oh, it was just the wealthy people who were mummified in Egypt. And that's actually not true. Unless you were a prisoner of war or a pauper, you got some degree of mummification as part of your burial ritual. And also just the climate of India preserves collagen and preserves things so that we can actually check very closely what they ate. And the Egyptian population, the way I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, they were literally eating the diet that is now recommended by the USDA and the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association. Almost no red meat, lots of legumes, lots of grains, lots of plants, fruits, quite a bit of honey. Every now and then they had some chicken or fish, but they very often they use cows to pull things. They didn't use cows to eat. And so when we look at them from a medical pathology standpoint, their bodies are riddled with chronic disease markers. They had severe atherosclerotic disease in their heart arteries, in their aortas. So they were eating the ancient wheat, not the modern GMO wheat, right? It was stone ground, non-GMO, ancient. I think they were eating emmer wheat, if I'm not mistaken. And so
Could be. I don't know.
You can't blame it on the modern wheat because they didn't have that. You can't blame it on sugar because sugar as a commodity hadn't even been invented yet. And
Right.
so give us some insight on the Egyptian culture, the Egyptian diet, and what that tells us about eating meat and health.
I must say, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but this is not my area. And I stopped my research at about 10,000 years ago.
Gotcha.
So I know everything that you said. Most of what you said, I know from just, reading here and there. But I really, this is no, it's Mike Eads, I think, is better than this section.
Yes, and I
So
appreciate your honesty because I definitely don't want you to step out of your lane and talk about something that you don't have expertise in. Let's talk about fire. From my armchair reading, it looks like we were probably taking advantage of fire even before 1 million years ago, but maybe about 1 million years ago, give or take, we harnessed, learned to use fire as a tool on a daily basis. And there are some people in the anthropological literature who try to say that's where our large Homo sapiens sapien brain come from. We were able to unlock the nutrition in plants, tubers, grains by cooking them starting about 1 million years ago. Do you have any problems with that theory, and what can you enlighten us on with regards to fire as a tool?
it's funny. I just finished, and I have it in review now. I just submitted a paper to a very good journal. Let's see if it gets accepted, but I'm still waiting the reviewer's comment on that. And the paper claims that, you see, let's start with the beginning. The story of fire and the importance of fire was first realized by a researcher from Harvard named Wrangham. And Wrangham, in his initial paper, really emphasized the fact that the cooking by fire enabled the consumption of tubers. So Wrangham is a researcher he's primatologist. He's researching, spends a lot of time in Uganda following chimpanzees. He's not an archaeologist. And he came with that idea, and he is also a vegetarian. So that idea that humans could consume plants was very important step in their evolution appealed to him, I presume. Later on, if you read these papers, you see that already he's getting away from that part of it, and he's talking about the importance of cooking for meat as well. Anyway, in 1917, one smart researcher started to measure what is the energetic expense of collecting wood and setting up fire. And it turned out that the expense is higher than the reward on cooking.
Interesting.
And so that presents a conundrum. So why do you find, and you correctly said you find some residues a million years ago, and for me, I came with what I think is the answer, or my answer anyway, is that actually fire was used in the preservation and protection of meat. And because when the energetic return on hunting is 20, 10, 60,000 calories per hour, and the return on gathering plants is about 1,400 calories per hour. If somebody steals your meat, you lose a lot of, and alternative energy. And this is what actually can justify the spending the energy to set up the fire. So, and also what is unique to humans is that humans bring their meat to a central place. We're not like lions that eat the meat at the spot. We actually bring it to our space, and then we consume it over days, weeks, and even months. For instance, if you take down an elephant, and by the way, a million years ago, elephants weighed 12 tons. Elephant today weighs 6, 4, so at least double the size of the present elephants. There were different species. You could live off the elephant for months, but you have to preserve the meat. So smoking the meat and drying it over fire is a energetically profitable operation. So that's the paper I have put in. So actually, the fact that you find fire, in my opinion, is support for the fact that we relied on large prey very early in our evolution.
And so you use as evidence to support that you gain so much more nutrition from an hour of hunting than you gain from an hour of gathering. And then when you talk about the caloric expense of gathering the firewood, bringing it back to a central location, you would actually be a net loss if you were collecting that firewood to cook your tubers and your grains and your other vegetables. You actually would be in a negative calorie and nutrition balance.
Absolutely. Look, cooking increase the return or the energetic return on plants by about, let's say, 10%, just to make the calculation easy. It may be 12%, but let's say to make it easy. So if your return is 1440 calories, 1,440 calories, something like that. That's what I came up with, like based on the data that I could find. So 10% is 140 calories that you save. Yeah. But if somebody steal your elephant or whatever meat, yeah, halfway, then you lose 30,000 calories. So there's no comparison.
It doesn't seem like there should be at all. And so again, to be very clear, is there any evidence before 13 to 15,000 years ago the evidence that we have shows, and would you say that every single dig, archaeological, paleoanthropological, every single dig we found that we've done stable isotope analysis on, is there a single example in the literature of a society or an individual that was a plant eater predominantly, or that didn't maximize their intake of fatty meat, fatty megafauna, or at least fish and clamshells, crustaceans and mollusks? Is there a single example in the paleoanthropological literature before 12,000 years ago of an individual or society that ate a plant-based diet?
None whatsoever, as far as I can remember. I must qualify that.
Yes,
but as far as I can remember, as far as I know, none whatsoever. 100% of them come up as carnivores.
And when we look at, I love how we call the technology that our ancestors developed 50,000 years ago, 50 to 60,000 with bows and arrows. And then further back, I think probably the first technological discovery was when someone was probably trying to break open a bone, and they struck a rock against another rock, and the rock split, and there's this razor sharp edge on the rock. I love how anthropologists love to call these things Stone Age tools, when really what they should be called is weapons, because I don't know of a single.
No, they used it. They used it as tools as well, to get the meat off the bones, etc., and to cut the meat, etc. So they use it to also to prepare the spears. So they use it as tools. And by the way, I just want to be a little bit more balanced here.
Yes.
There are plenty of evidence for the consumption of plants.
Yes.
So people did consume plants, no question about it. And like I said, all the plants that they could put their hand on. So I think that mostly these plants came from women, because it's something that typifies humans, is that we have a division of labor. So the women, because they take care of the children, cannot go far away from the camp because of safety reasons. So I think that the certain, you see, as an economist, I'm working by alternative. So what was the alternative of this woman? It was not to hunt. So they had to spend the free time somehow to do something and to bring some benefits. And it was enough if they just got some plants. So yes, they did eat plants, but like you said, if you take 12,000 years ago, all the, as far as I remember, all the stable isotope, and there are many other pieces of evidence, and we haven't even started on the non-archaeological evidence. Like I said, the archaeological evidence, only the stable isotope can give you quantitative. But then I found out that actually most of the evidence is in the body, is right in us. We are carnivores. We are adapted to carnivory, and there are many pieces of evidence that are showing that. Okay, including the acidity, the level of acidity now, the structure of our fat cells, the weaning, how long we breastfeed, etc., etc. So, and this is a paper that I published where I got some, like, I think 15 pieces of evidence from biology alone, to the fact that we are carnivores. We are adapted to carnivory. Genetic evidence, biological evidence.
Let's talk about, with regard to the fossil remains of our ancestors, the height, the bone length, the bone strength, bone pathology, tooth pathology, I don't know if you've read widely in paleopathology, but it seems to me, ample evidence, because we actually, especially there's a great example of a research paper that looked at two different Native American tribes. One was predominantly a corn eater and a plant eater. The other tribe predominantly a meat eater. And these people lived about 20 miles apart, these two different cultures. And we were able to look at their bones and, first of all, verify their diets by stable isotope analysis, but then also look at the health of their bones, the health of their joints, the health of their teeth. What do we find from studies like that with regards to predominantly meat eaters versus predominantly plant eaters in the anthropological record?
Okay, in archaeology, the easiest place to go is teeth, because teeth preserve quite well, including the pathology in teeth can be associated with nutrition. So mostly the teeth are of ancestor of if you go, let's say there's a very famous picture of famous among archaeologists of a picture of a skull of the first identified Homo sapiens. That's from Irhoud in Morocco, I think. And and you see the perfect teeth, perfect teeth. And this guy was maybe 40 years old or so. So most of the teeth that we find in the early Paleolithic, or just before, let's say the end of the Paleolithic, are perfect. You have some, some sort of, what's the name of this illness that the teeth, I forgot the name, some signs of, in very few of them, very few teeth that are crooked a little bit. But the first time that you find a very large incident, high incidence of problematic teeth, caries. This is the word I was looking for. With caries, is in Morocco, in a cave called the Cave of Pigeon or something, and there you find also a sign that they ate a lot of acorns. And this is the first time that you find real, appearance of caries. So yes, and this is 15,000 years ago. So just by near the end of the Paleolithic, so you see that in the end, the animals, the large animals, or the animals that contained fat, this was the problem. The problem was not animals; it was animals that could get fat, because there's no problem getting protein. The problem is getting fat. And fat and small animals don't have a lot of fat. Relatively speaking, even. I'm not just saying about,
yes.
Of course, they won't have as much fat as an elephant, but relatively speaking, they have a small amount of fats. Let's say they would have 30% fat in terms of caloric condition, where large animals will have 50%, 60% fat. So when the large animals disappeared towards the end of the Paleolithic, they had to start eating more plants, and you could see it from the teeth. The teeth, you find much more caries prevalence than before.
And so, to be clear, about how long ago did we really start to see the incidence of cavities, caries, dental abscesses, weakness in the teeth, weakness in the jaw bones?
The first time was in 15,000 years ago. This is the earliest appearance of significant cavities.
And then that was
You find some a million years ago also. I mean, one teeth here and there,
right.
but really, like in one site, many teeth. You find only 50,000 years ago.
Gotcha. Is there any way that the stable isotope analysis data showing that, without exception, all human ancestors before 15,000 years ago ate lots of meat, lots of seafood, if they were close to that source? Is there any way that the stable isotope analysis could be wrong? How could it be wrong?
Yeah, that I tell you, sometimes, you see that researchers are trying to prove something, and they take uh, present examples, and they say that humans have a tendency to show higher levels of nitrogen 15 than other animals. But the fact is, if you go back and you see that when you're sure that people ate plants, a lot of plants, and sometimes, I mean, in agricultural sites, archaeological agricultural sites, you can verify that.
Yep.
You find that they ate plants based on that isotope level. So it's not like, when they eat plants, it doesn't show up. It shows up. The other thing that they say is that the nitrogen only exists in the protein. Okay, so it doesn't show 100% of the consumption. You could still eat lots of plants that won't register because they don't have a lot of protein in them. But they forget about fat. Fat doesn't have any isotope, right? Nitrogen isotope in it. And humans, and this is, by the way, you can verify from the archaeological record. You can verify that they actually were looking for fat, and it's also a conclusion that's based on recent hunter-gatherers. When they were interviewed or where they followed, it was obvious to the researchers, and there's very, very a lot of evidence for that they actually loved fat and they were looking for fat. And when they hunted the animal without fat, they just left it sometimes, unless they were very hungry. So if you see that humans ate fat or were looking for fat, it means that the plants could not provide the non-protein part of the diet. So humans are limited in their protein consumption to about 35% of the calories. So if they could get plants at a reasonable energetic return, they would go for it, because they still have to consume 65% of the diet from non-protein sources. But they were looking for fat like crazy. So it means that they could not get it from plants.
Excellent. We're coming up on the top of the hour, Doctor. I don't want to keep you too long. Give us a summation based on everything you know about paleoanthropology, archaeology. What principles should we apply to our modern diet, given the fact that our DNA hasn't really changed much over the last 300,000 years? What basic principles would you say, do the following, don't do the following, based on what you know about the history of our ancestors?
Okay, like I say, I like to play it safe.
Yes.
And the safest food for me is animal source food. But I would also draw attention to high levels of protein consumption, because the fact is that according to my studies, humans ate a lot of protein compared to what we eat today. They were, in my opinion, close to 30% of their diet, protein. Now, I know that there are studies that you can get away with 0.8 gram per kilogram, which is, I don't know what it comes up to, but maybe 10% protein or whatever. But I would say if you can eat 2.5 gram per kilogram, I don't know exactly what the advantages are, but I can tell you that your ancestors evolved on a diet of that kind of level of protein. And of course, I'll complete it with fat. The composition of fat, I suppose, should be like the composition of animal fat, which is about 40%. Just to be very, very general, 40% monounsaturated, 40% saturated, and even more than 40% of each, but let's say 13% maximum of polyunsaturated. And if you eat plants, make sure that they are prepared, that they are fermented, that you know exactly how sensitive you are to them, and try to eat as little as possible.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Ben-Dor. It's been a pleasure. If you will send me a list of all of your published and pending research, I'll put a link of all of them in the show notes. I appreciate your time today, and I thank you very much for being part of this live stream inside of our private group. Thank you very much.
Thank you.